Hey guys, it's Dylan from the Dyl Pickle Movie Network. If you're watching as part of this subathon, continue watching, continue subbing, continue liking, continue chatting along. If you're watching this after the fact, we did a subathon. It was amazing. It is amazing. It's happening right now. But part of the subathon is going to be giving you reviews for movies that I missed. And the first film we're going to be talking about as part of the subathon review series is Love Lies Bleeding, which until Challengers came out was my favorite movie of the year so far. This has just been such a great year for just eroticism in film, and not in the sense where like it's watching pornography on the screen or anything, but just the idea that like sex and sexual intrigue and sexual tension is becoming such a big part of storytelling, especially in character dynamics. You see it especially in challengers, which I talked about on the channel in the review. The idea that it's a tennis match, but really it's about something else. It's about the rivalry. It's about the back and forth between these two guys fighting over this girl. It's very sexually charged. And I think in Love Lies Bleeding, you could kind of make a similar comparison where it is this crime story about them trying to hide this criminal activity and get away with hiding this body. It's hard to talk about this film without going deep into spoilers. And because it's a subathon and so many people are watching, I'm not going to go into spoilers, but it's very much the Bound thing of like trying to hide something or trying to get away with something, trying to get rid of a crime, but also, doing it in the midst of this brewing sexual tension and, in this case, sexual discovery, because this centers around a couple played by Kristen Stewart and played by Katie O'Brien, who are both just exceptional in this film, but they are very much new to each other. They've just met. Kristen Stewart's character works at a gym. She actually works as like the maintenance person and the front desk person. We quite literally see her for the first time. She's got her hand like deep in a toilet trying to like unclog some shit and toilet paper out of this toilet. It's quite disgusting, but it kind of just shows this off the bat, this kind of griminess to the film. It feels like a very kind of grindhousey like film with the texture of it, but it's done in a very artful manner. It doesn't feel like it was just kind of scrounged up and thrown together on a screen like some grindhouse stuff, like some more schlocky B movie stuff will. There's still a prestige to it. There's still a sheen to it that I really, really appreciate. But it does deal a lot in this like kind of sticky, oily, kind of very dirty atmosphere. And I think that kind of goes in parallel with the story of it too. Because she is a gym manager. She falls hard for this bodybuilder played by Katie O'Brien, who's just this amazingly muscular woman, and they also play into the sexuality of that as well, that she has this more like bigger build, but their love causes them to do something violent, and it ends up kind of leading to this spinning web and snowball effect of all these potential things going wrong. Who saw what, when, and where, and why? Where is the blood trail? Where are we dumping the body? All these things that you see in a lot of crime movies. I mean, a lot of these subject matters that have been dealt here have been seen in other crime movies, but I think it's because of the foundation of the relationship that makes Love Lies Bleeding feel different than anything before it. It is directed by Rose Glass, who previously directed Saint Maud, a festival darling horror film that I never saw because I heard it was very scary from some people, and then I just never really got around to seeing it on my own. I just for some reason missed it. Maybe because it was so scary, I didn't want to check it out. Maybe it's because it wasn't on my radar enough. But I had kept seeing the posters. But Love Lies Bleeding, I mean, when it has Kristen Stewart in it, who I'm a big fan of, it has Ed Harris, Dave Franco, Gina Malone, all these actors I'm a big fan of. So I knew going into it I would like it. And I was intrigued by the premise. I mean, I love the idea of the Bound comparisons, because Bound is one of my favorite movies ever, directed by the Wachowskis, which is a similar idea of, this lesbian couple trying to get away with murder in a way, this crime story. But in this sense, it continued to surprise me because, like I said, it continues to hit these like more conventional crime beats, but there were so many different twists and turns and moments where I was truly astounded. Like, I never saw that coming, or oh my gosh, I forgot that person was there at that crosswalk at that stoplight. Oh my god, what is that going to bring to the story? And then several characters' deaths, which you don't see coming. Now, there's one huge moment, huge is a good word for it, that happens that is quite literally what no one could have predicted. But it is one of those fantastical moments that I really like because it kind of leads to, kind of lends to the trippiness of it, kind of like the drugged up atmosphere of like everything's a little hallucinogen, a little loopy, a little crazy, and then we're seeing this like really polarizing image, and it is a great image. I love it. I love the wackiness that this film gets into. I know how some people could say that this maybe should have been a little bit more realistic, a little bit more grounded. But I think because it is so grimy and dirty and realistic for so long, I think it's kind of cool when it takes a more fantastical twist. Also, because I think it makes more interesting use of the metaphors of this film and what this woman wants to be seen as, what she is seen as, what the pressure of society views her as. And there's a lot about body image in this film that I think is really important, and drug use. I mean, this film just tackles so much. And I think there's something to be said about a film that does take a very conventional outline and fills it in with the most intricate and interesting details. And I think Love Lies Bleeding is one of those things. I think Kristen Stewart and Katie O'Brien have such a good chemistry together. I think they really just, from second one, you understand why those two are so attracted to one another, both sexually but also emotionally. And yes, this film does get sexual. I mean, I think that's a theme with a lot of these films that deal with these homoerotic or erotic themes. But I do think it's not all about that. And that does help kind of strengthen the bond of these characters. You know, they don't feel like pointless sex scenes. They feel like sex scenes that make sense for the, the character's growth. But also, yeah, just the way it kind of aids in the dilemmas of the characters later on in the film, where they genuinely don't know what decision to make because they don't want to hurt the other one. I mean, this really is a film that relies on you being invested in this relationship above all else. And I think the more invested you are with the relationship, the more difficult it is for the audience to watch because you genuinely don't know where it's going to go. I think the supporting players are all very good, especially Ed Harris, who is so unrecognizable. I think the makeup here is really great as well. Obviously, Katie O'Brien is really putting on those muscles. That is not makeup. That is not faked. She's genuinely that ripped, which I think is just so amazing and impressive. And I would not want to take her in a fight ever. I wouldn't want to take any of these actors in a fight, but especially not her. But I think Ed Harris has one of the cooler transformations because at first when I saw him, I didn't even recognize him. He was totally unrecognizable. But I really did love to see his character as well, because there are moments where, you know, when you're dealing with the villain of a movie, you don't necessarily know if, you know, you want him to be redeemed. And in this case, you don't ever want him to be redeemed, but there are things he says sometimes that make a lot of sense. And there are moments where you almost want the characters to give in because you don't want him to hurt them. But then also there are moments where you remember that what Kristen Stewart did in this movie and her and Katie O'Brien, they do still do some criminal stuff, whether or not it's, you know, it's almost like the anti-hero thing of like, yes, they're doing something bad, but it's also to get under the skin of someone even worse, but they are still doing a bad thing. And I think that's kind of what this movie plays with well, are those like moral gray areas, just the very interesting twists and turns. I could really go on about it. I mean, I think from beginning to last frame, the way this is shot and the way this is stylized is so interesting. I think very quickly Rose Glass has really established what her style is, and I think there are very few movies that feel so authentically this style. It feels like a lot of the time style like this is kind of just put on as a gimmick, almost as like an afterthought. Like, oh well, let's make it a little grimier and a little grittier. Here, it feels like the grime and the grit is intentional from minute one, when she has her hand up that toilet, and when it's really getting started with those really heavy uses of red. I mean, so much red. It just oozes with the color red. If you love the color red, you're going to love this movie. If you're colorblind and can't see the color red, I hope you still enjoy this movie because it's so red. There's so much red. But I really do think she just shows so much confidence and so much strength. This is only her second film, yet I feel like she has been making films and films and films for a whole career now, because this feels so very fine-tuned, very specific, very well thought out, very detailed. So it's a big, glowing recommendation for me. Love Lies Bleeding. It is hopefully still playing near you, but if it's not, check it out when you can watch it on streaming, because it's one of those films that I think is only going to get better for me on rewatch once I know where everything ends up, just going back and kind of seeing where all the puzzle pieces fit together. So thank you so much for watching this review. Let me know what you thought of Love Lies Bleeding in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching. Hey everyone, if you're watching the Subathon, keep watching, continue watching. If you're not watching the Subathon and you're watching this review after the fact, hello, I'm Dylan Randazzo. Welcome to the Dyl Pickle Movie Network. It's hard to do this in both a live stream format and in mind of, I got to air this afterwards as well. But regardless, it is very late at night, so it's time for a late night with the Devil review. And because we're running a little bit behind on schedule, I'm going to make this a pretty brief review, but I just needed to tell you all about how exciting this movie is. Every year there's a horror film that kind of comes out of nowhere. It just blows me away, and this year it was Late Night with the Devil. It's one of those films, I thought it had a cool premise. It's what if you were watching a television broadcast and someone brought on a girl who said she was possessed by the devil or said she could communicate with the devil, and then an exorcism happens on screen and you're able to see this girl kind of become this devil persona, but as if you were watching a late night television event. Now, I am unfortunate in the fact that I have not seen all the great late night events happen. I don't watch a lot of late night TV, and that's not really to say that a lot of late night stuff happens on TV anymore. I mean, really, because of how hyper secure people are nowadays, if something major happens, they're able to bleep it out, they're able to cut it out. The biggest thing I can think of is the Will Smith slap at the Oscars. But that would be like Will Smith times 20 in this sense, because this kind of goes into the stratosphere of just absolute mania that you would just never expect to see on an actual late night show. And what I love so much about this movie in particular, aside from Davis Dastmalchian's performance, who I think is exceptional in everything he's in, I'm so glad he actually has an outlet to be the lead of this and to like really command the screen and just be so good in this. But one of the things I also really love about it is the style. They're really able to capture that old aesthetic so well. Now, there's one element of the style that I don't like, and that is the use of AI to create these kind of title cards that happen in and out of commercials. Because how the film is structured, or how the TV mockumentary is structured, is you're basically watching the TV episode, and then if something goes wrong and they cut to commercial, we kind of see a behind the scenes video, which is more in black and white of what happened when the cameras cut, which is a very interesting device. Now, I think the actual black and white stuff doesn't sell that it's part of the 70s as well as the actual on-screen stuff. Like, I think the actual TV set and like the way it's shot when they're on air is very successful in capturing that 70s vibe. But I think for a film that kind of goes behind the scenes during the commercial breaks, I think they could have made that kind of camera work a little grainier, a little bit more of the 70s aesthetic. But regardless, it's a really cool device to be able to see like, oh, what would happen if you were just watching this episode play out, but you also got to be someone looking behind the scenes at what was happening. And you see how it kind of builds. He brings on a clairvoyant who kind of can read people's minds, and then something goes a little awry, then he brings on someone who basically tries to disprove magic tricks and basically say, here's how you did the trick, almost like a Penn and Teller fool us type deal, where they're like, we love the trick, but here's how you did it, and here's how I know you're a phony, kind of one of those skeptics. And then you bring on the little girl as like the final, step. It's almost like a video game. Like, you're kind of achieving each level, and each level it gets a little creepier, a little weirder, a little wilder, and then it just kind of blows the roof off the place, quite literally. But I really just love the way the tension builds in this thing with that style, and trying to make it seem horrific in the parameters that the movie sets for itself, because it is made on a small budget. But like I said, the AI stuff I'm not a fan of, but it is such a little part of it that I think I'm able to still enjoy the film at large. But I really just love how the tension builds, how it still embraces that style, how we kind of can relate to that TV culture of you need to get the most clicks, you need to get the most views in terms of YouTube. I mean, I'm literally running a subathon right now trying to get more subscribers. I mean, I feel like a lot of the times the media is just focused on getting eyes on things, that when something terrific or horrific like this happens, it's like, well, what did you ask for? Be careful what you wish for, because this is very much centered around a guy who is selfish, who wants to get anything for publicity. And he brings on his dying wife in this prologue kind of backstory, where you see him kind of introduce his wife, and she basically gets the opportunity to say goodbye because she's dying of an illness on air, and it boosts his ratings. And it's like one of those things where it's like, did you really want to do that, or are you just doing that for the ratings? And I think that is what the film is most successful at. It's not even the horror, which had me legitimately scared. I mean, I think because it does feel so real, like you're watching just a real live show happen, I think that aids the horror. But also, I just think the idea of the person going to the extremes to get the perfect shot, and then when you realize you've gone too far, how do you rein it back? How do you say, oh, we made a mistake? And I think that's what's most interesting about this film and most fun to see play out. So I highly recommend this film. I think it's one of those great star-making turns for David Dastmalchian that I hope gets him more work. The AI is not something to applaud, but it is something that I think more people will watch this and learn from and be like, maybe not the best idea, and hopefully remedy in the future. But regardless, I think this is a fantastic horror film. You can watch it on Shudder right now. You all missed it in theaters if you didn't see it in theaters, but though it was a quite amazing experience. But if you haven't seen it, watch it on Shudder. It's very good. So that's my review for Late Night with the Devil. Hey everyone, welcome to the Dyl Pickle Movie Network. I am Dylan Randazzo. If you are watching our subathon, keep watching, keep liking, subscribing, keep it going. I know we're in the middle of the night right now. We are almost done though. We're about 3/4 of the way through. We had a great episode of Frame Wreck just before this. We still got one more big review coming after this for Dune Part 2. But this is my Immaculate review. Is it going to be an Immaculate review of Immaculate? Well, we'll have to find out, because the movie itself is not quite immaculate, but I still think there's some pluses to it. I think there's some greatness to it, and that is obviously Sweeney Sydney. It's late, guys. Sydney Sweeney. She is great in this. This is essentially kind of the Rosemary's Baby thing of woman comes to this convent or whatever. She's a nun, and then she starts to have these sicknesses, and then finds out she's pregnant. But wait, she's a virgin. How could she have been impregnated? And then it becomes this whole conversation of how did she get pregnant, and is she fostering the devil or the baby Jesus? And I think that's one of this very common tropes you see in a lot of these movies. I mean, this literally came out, I believe, a weekend or two before The First Omen, which also dealt with very similar things. I didn't see that film yet. I want to, and I heard it's great, and I heard it's even better than this. But I think if you've seen a film like this film does not necessarily hit you as hard because it's kind of taking a formula that you've seen time and time again. And I can't say it does it necessarily as good or better than those. I mean, Rosemary's Baby is an all-timer, so it's hard for me to compare. But even like stuff like The Omen, The Exorcist, that still deal with like creepy possessed kids. I know that we're seeing like this trend of horror where they're kind of harkening back to those older days. But I think you still need to do something to set yourself apart a little bit. And I think really the only thing that does set this one apart from others is Sydney Sweeney's performance, who I think again is very good. Now, I talked in my Love Lies Bleeding review that horny cinema is at an all-time high right now in a resurgence. You know, you got Challengers, you've got Love Lies Bleeding, Drive-Away Dolls, Miller's Girl, I mean, Dune with those popcorn buckets. There's a lot of horny shit out there for cinema right now. Lisa Frankenstein, a lot of stuff that is like dealt with either sexual tension or sexual chemistry or sex in general. And the fact that the movie starring Sydney Sweeney is the only one that's overtly not sexual, that's overtly saying, no, I didn't have sex, I didn't, make this baby, I think is very interesting. And it's kind of cool to see her play against type there too, because I feel like a lot of the time people don't realize how good of an actress she is because they just want to sexualize her. They just want to kind of make her the sex symbol, which she does stand for in some of her works. You know, Anyone But You is very much about the sexual chemistry between Sydney Sweeney and Glenn Powell, and the film and the marketing didn't try to hide that at all. But I think it's really cool to see her just kind of flex that she's a great actress, because I think she is. And I think in this film, it really proves it. I think the second half of this film is more interesting than the first because it doesn't really deal with the mystery as much as it does the escape, because the first half is just kind of the mystery of what's going on, who's this baby, what's going to happen, and it's all the kind of stuff we've seen before. The second half, though, is where she says, F it, I'm going to escape, I'm going to get away from these people, and it's the chase, cat and mouse chase of her trying to get away, and then it becomes almost like a slasher film where she's kind of the final girl getting hunted. But then also, once the baby finally comes, we see one of the craziest scenes and one of the best acted scenes of the year. It's this one shot of Sydney Sweeney. I'm not going to share what it is, what happens, or what she is reacting to, but her face is just the center of that camera lens, that shot that whole time, and just watching her react and watching her kind of have this final moment with very few words of dialogue, but just kind of grunts and screams and facial expressions and wide eyes and blood covered face. I think it's one of the great final scenes of a movie of this year, and I don't really think the movie is all that great, but I think moments like that kind of leave me leaving the theater in a positive manner. Like, I'm leaving the theater being like, that was a good time, rather than, oh, that sucked. Whereas I think if I left a halfway through, which I would never leave a movie halfway through, but if the movie had ended a halfway through, I might not have liked it as much, because I think it ends much stronger than it starts. And I do want to bring up the director, Michael Mohan, because I didn't think this was his best work, or even his best collaboration with Sydney Sweeney. I wanted to bring up The Voyeurs, which, if you are into the more like Challengers, Love Lies Bleeding, horny cinema, you would probably really like The Voyeurs, because it is very much I think a better movie than Immaculate, but B, also kind of fits into that like sexual tension type deal about this couple who kind of spies on their neighbors, and then stuff starts to happen. It's almost like a Rear Window, but with like a 50 Shades of Grey tint to it. But I think that's a really interesting film as well. So it's really cool to just see Michael Mohan also kind of do something different with his career. Like, one minute he's making this kind of trashy Amazon Prime voyeur melodrama, and then he's making a film about nuns and the baby devil Jesus or whatever. So I really think it's cool to see him just kind of take a different stance as a filmmaker and kind of make something new and not necessarily be a one-trick pony. Even though he's worked with the same actress twice, she definitely have done something completely different here. And I think that's what is most exciting about Immaculate, is that it's not necessarily different from things we've seen before, but it's different than things we've seen them do before. And I think that's what's exciting about any filmmaker, is seeing them really stretch themselves and be like, oh, I would not have assumed that the person who made The Voyeurs made Immaculate. And I would not have assumed that the girl who was in The Voyeurs was also the lead of Immaculate, like Sydney Sweeney, and that she could also do with Euphoria and The White Lotus and Anyone But You. You know, I think they just have such versatility and such range that I think Immaculate really shows off. So it is not necessarily a glaring recommendation, but I do think if you're a Sydney Sweeney fan, I think this is some of her best acting she's ever done. And I think if you are a fan of that type of filmmaking, then you might like the first hour more than I did. And if you haven't seen a story like that, you might like this a lot more, because I think it's one of those things where if you're not used to that trope, it actually is a really exciting reveal and a really haunting one as well. So Immaculate might not be an immaculate film, but it is a good film nonetheless, and I do recommend it slightly, but mostly for that performance. So thank you so much for watching. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Dyl Pickle Movie Network. I am Dylan Randazzo. If you are watching as part of our subathon, thank you so much for watching. We are live. You all are chatting away, liking, subbing all day, all the past 24 hours. It has been really exciting. The last of my big reviews I'm going to do here is my Dune Part 2 review. It's a review that I've been sitting on the back burner. I did a show Sunday in the Park with George. It was a beautiful time, a beautiful experience. And I did see a lot of movies while I was doing that show, but I didn't have time to review a lot of movies. And so it's been great to get out my reviews for Love Lies Bleeding, for, of course, Late Night with the Devil and Immaculate. But now the one that I kind of saved for last, because it is the big one. It is Dune Part 2. And a lot of people have been asking, Dylan, did you like this one? Yes, I liked it. Dylan, did you like this as much as the first one? And that question is a little harder to answer. And that's not to say that Dune Part 2 is inferior technically. I think technically this is a massive step up from the first. I think honestly the biggest weakness of the first film wasn't even anything to do with its story beats. I think the biggest weakness of the first film was some of those darker moments being maybe a little bit too dull, a little bit too drab, a little bit too grim. I think especially watching it at home, I kind of noticed that a little bit more, that when you're not in the cinema and you're not able to really like be surrounded by blackness all around, when you kind of have any light shining at all which way, the TV screen, I don't know. It just felt like some moments weren't 100% perfect in terms of its color and its texture. Whereas in Dune Part 2, every single frame of this feels just so fine-tuned. I mean, even though the first one had a big budget, you can tell that this budget is just a smidgen bigger, because I think every single color just pops that much more. Every single frame of this thing, every single image is just so sharp, so finely tuned, so finely crafted. I really think it's one of those just extraordinarily crafted films. And I think if you were looking at a stylistic parallel, I think this blows the first one out of the water. As for the actual plot construction and the character development, I think there are things that this film does much better than the first one, but also there are things I think it doesn't do as well as the first one. And I think that's kind of been the biggest pushback I've gotten when I've told people that leaving the theater this time, I preferred Part 1. I did walk out of Part 1 more satisfied than I did Part 2. Now, I have seen Part 2 twice. I took my mom to see it a second time, and I think that actually heightened my experience of Part 2, because the scene where Paul rides the worm, there was this moment in the theater where I looked at my mom, and she looked at me, and she was grinning with like this giddy excitement that I rarely see from my mom during a movie. I'll usually see it after. She'll be like, "That was so good," or we'll be in the car. She was like, "Oh, I love that," but not really during a movie do I look at her and she's like, "Oh my God, this is awesome." And I was like, you know what? This is the magic of the movies. It's not just the movie itself, but getting to look at my mom in her eyes and seeing how elated and filled with joy she was. I mean, that was the magic of the movies. And that's where I think now, if you were to ask me, I'd probably say Dune Part 2 is my favorite. But I think that's a testament to Denis Villeneuve as a filmmaker, as a creator, the fact that I see both these movies almost evenly and almost neck and neck. And I really do think there's something interesting to be said about the commentary I've seen about the first film and how a lot of people haven't really felt that way about the second film. They see this film as a more complete film. They see this film as a real definitive conclusion. They see that the characters are all used well and not just there for marketing. But the more I think about this movie, and I do think this movie has a solid conclusion. I do think the characters are well used, but I think it's a little hypocritical looking at some of the comparisons of the first and second movie and seeing how they were once criticisms that are now things that people are applauding. For example, the whole notion that Part 1 doesn't end. Part 1 just ends in the middle. It doesn't have a conclusion. It's just merely setting up the next one. Now, this film ends with him becoming the Messiah, becoming the leader, whatever. And he's got the power. He's in the throne. The end. But the whole last scene is very, very much, and sorry this is getting into spoiler territory, but this movie's been out forever, and we are in the middle of the morning, early morning, so I don't know how many people really will be listening to this live, but There's something to be said though about the fact that this movie ends with him quite literally setting up this new chapter to marry the emperor's daughter, and the emperor's daughter very much reminded me of the criticisms people had of Zendaya in the first film, where a lot of people were like she was only in it periodically in little dream sequences. I think the same could be said for Florence Pugh, where she's very much in it very periodically and very infrequently, that I really don't see how her role in this film is any different than Zendaya's in the last film, and how him deciding now to join the emperor and rule and marry the emperor's daughter is any different than him joining the Fremen. And I understand that in movies you want to progress and tease the next film, and that's fine. But all I'm saying is that if you have that problem with the first film, then why don't you have it with the second film? And if you are fine with it in the second film, then why are you not fine with it in the first film? And I think really it's because the book, people are so used to it ending in a specific spot. But if you were to look at these movies side by side, they technically do share that very similar element where Zendaya and Florence Pugh are very much the people that we will see as love interests in the next film, but in the previous film, very sporadically shown throughout. And then the ending being Paul kind of taking this next step towards something else is still, the same in both movies. Even though it's a different thing, it is the same overall journey, and I think that's very interesting. Now, here in this film, we get a lot more Zendaya because she wasn't as huge a part last time. She gets a big part in this movie, so much so to where I think this is just as much her movie as it is Paul's. And I guess maybe that's why people think it's a little bit more of a final stamp, because she has a very definitive final moment. It honestly reminds me of Across the Spider-Verse, how at that end of that movie it still left a lot of things open for Miles, but it felt like Gwen's story of finally getting acceptance from her father and being accepted as Gwen was complete. And I think that's kind of what can be said here, whereas Paul, I think his journey is still just getting started because he's finally now in power. Now we're going to see what he does with it. I still think there is a final chapter to the story, and hopefully we get it. I think we're getting it. I think it's been confirmed Dune Messiah will come out, but I do think there's something to be said about Paul's journey not being complete. But I think Chani's journey, I'm very interested to see if that is complete, because I do think she is someone who, has a really great final moment in the way that Gwen has a great final moment in Across the Spider-Verse. She still will probably be in the next one, and the next one will probably deal with her character quite a bunch, but I feel like her arc in this film and what her identity and what her family and what her being means to her is very well concluded in this film. And honestly, I think that's the biggest strength of this film, is just seeing Timothée Chalamet's Paul character with Zendaya's character and with Javier Bardem's character, who is so funny in this movie. He's a comedic relief, which I didn't expect given the first film. I didn't expect him to be the comedic relief of it. I didn't expect there to be a comedic relief, so it was very relieving. I guess that's why they call it that. That there was some sort of comedic relief here, but I did like how he just kind of found a way to be one with the people. He didn't want to be anything special, and then to see his arc kind of overcome him in this darker way by the end. It's a very dark arc, and it's very hard to watch, but it is a very emotional one. Now, where I think the film does lose a little bit of its traction is in the Rebecca Ferguson plot, where I think the ideas are very interesting, but I think they're also kind of glossed over at times. I think the first time I watched it, I didn't even really understand what was going on with the whole drinking of the blue stuff, and then her seemingly dying, but then coming back as a stronger person, and it kind of happens again to Paul later. I think when I rewatched it, I was able to grasp it a little bit better. But the first movie is so much about their relationship that I feel like the second movie, I would have liked to really see that turning where she really is manipulating those people. They keep talking about how the Bene Gesserit have spread these words about the Messiah and have really ingrained this idea in people's heads. Yet we don't see a lot of that. We don't see a lot of the manipulation and stuff. And I understand that people are like, oh, it's Paul's point of view. But we also see scenes where Paul's not even in them, where we're talking to Florence Pugh and Charlotte Rampling and Stellan Skarsgård and Austin Butler. There are big chunks of this movie where Paul is not present. So I think there could have been time allotted for Rebecca Ferguson's character and the Bene Gesserit in general to have those moments where they're kind of underlying these little, maneuvers and trying to plan around Paul and kind of set this thing in motion, because they are so responsible for his rise or his fall, depending on how you look at it. But I do want to bring up Austin Butler, because I think he is the MVP, who ever since I grew up watching Zoe 101, I've always been not convinced that he can be a serious actor. I've always been like, how is this guy an A-lister, like big screen presence? And I saw him in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. I was like, damn, he's pretty good. Then I saw him in Elvis. I'm like, damn, he's really good. And then I saw him in this, and I'm like, he's on another level. I really think the way he's able to tap into this like sociopathic, psychopathic, envy and fury and weird, faces, and he makes these menacing faces, menacing glances by not making many expressions. He's just kind of blank staring at someone, and he'll like cock the head, or he'll put up like a slight eyebrow, or like extend his eye pupil a little bit. Like those subtle motions and those little very brief little glimmers of things are very interesting. I mean, it is really one of those very, very haunting performances and villain performances. And this is kind of one of my other complaints about the movie, is that I just wish they had introduced this character earlier. And I get the whole idea is that they want to like make this Paul in the Fremen thing established to then be like, well, who's going to challenge him? Boom, enter Austin Butler. But I do think because there is such a big build up to this fight between Paul and Austin Butler's character, I do think it would have been cool if maybe we open this film with the Austin Butler backstory. So then it makes it feel like he's a continued presence throughout. So when they finally battle at the end, it feels like the two characters we've been watching the whole time are finally duking it out. Like in Black Panther, for example, how we watch Killmonger grow up, we watch T'Challa's journey. So when they meet, it means something. Whereas here, Austin Butler's not even introduced till halfway through. And I think that's an interesting tactic. But I also think because Austin Butler is only introduced halfway through, then so much of it is spent on him that when we go back to Paul, it just feels a little uneven in terms of editing. And I think that's one of the things I did prefer about the first Dune, is that I feel like the first Dune, because it was a little bit more streamlined and because the focus was a little smaller, it was about this family basically coming to this new planet and basically getting Game of Thrones out of there, where everyone starts turning on them and then they realize, holy shit, we can't turn back and everyone's going to die. We have to either escape or die fighting. It's a very clear-cut story. It's very clear-cut. Here in this one, though, it's very much more expansive. We're dealing with a lot more elements here. We're dealing with these different rival families and the Emperor. I mean, the fact that Stellan Skarsgård and Christopher Walken are essentially emperors in their own right of different like groups of people, and that Stellan Skarsgård isn't the big bad, that's really Christopher Walken, or is he? Is it Charlotte Rampling? I think there's a lot of great, interesting political stuff going on in this film that we see in something like Game of Thrones or Lord of the Rings, where these like different families have these different ins and outs with one another. But the thing is, it is so much bigger and there is so much more to handle. And because you're spending so much time with Paul just being one of the Fremen, and you're dealing with the Bene Gesserit stuff with Rebecca Ferguson becoming the mother or whatever, there's just a lot that this film is tackling. And I think they do it in a very successful manner in terms of telling the story. But I think the editing between different story segments wasn't as crisp and coherent because the first film just was so streamlined and so able to focus on this single narrative journey. Whereas here you just have more elements. So it's ultimately going to be a little bit more difficult to edit. That being said, I still think this is a fantastic film. I think it is just one of those films that's born to be shown on the big screen, that is meant to be seen in the biggest way possible, the loudest way possible. I think if you watch this for the first time at home, you're doing yourself a disservice. You're doing yourself a disservice. But I really think it is one of those films that I think only gets better with the rewatch because you're able to see all the details and all the care that is so clearly put out for this film and for this franchise. I remember when I saw the first film, I sat in on a Q&A with Hans Zimmer and with Denis Villeneuve. And I remember Denis just talking about how astounded he was that he was able to kind of see his childlike vision come to light, and how Hans Zimmer had the same vision when he was a kid. When he would read the books, he would think of the score in his head as a kid of what that would sound like, and that is what came to fruition. Same with Denis Villeneuve being a kid and like kind of growing up only to see what his mind had thought up come to light. It's really amazing to see, and I'm really marveling at it. I consistently marvel at it. It's really beautiful to see. So the fact that it exists, it really is one of those magical movie films that it just encompasses the magic of the movies in the best way. And I'll never get that moment back of looking at my mother and seeing that wide-eyed childlike excitement on her face. Like, that is a moment I will hold dear and near to my heart forever. So that's my Dune Part 2 review. Let me know what you thought of Dune Part 2. And if you liked it a lot more than me, if you liked it more than the first one or less than this first one, I'm about even right now. Still slightly prefer the first one more, I'd say, even though the second one I think is a better step up cinematically. So please let me know down below what you think, or I guess to the side if we're on our live chat format. But I know this is going to air after the Subathon as well. So if you didn't watch the Subathon, go watch the Subathon. We streamed for 24 hours. This came at the very tail end of it. So at the time you're all seeing it at the Subathon, we're almost done with the Subathon. But if you're seeing it after the fact, go check out the Subathon. It was a lot of fun. So thank you so much.